Hi everyone, today we'll be restoring the bumper on this Nissan Altima. As you can see here, we have a very badly scratched up bumper, and on top of this the paint is chipped and peeled in a few areas, as well as we have this massive hole. All of this will be addressed shortly. In this video you will see how a damaged bumper can be made to look brand new using a few simple steps. These steps being sanding the surface to get rid of any large scratches, fixing broken or damaged sections of the bumper using bumper repair compound, then preparing the surface for painting using spot putty to get rid of minor imperfections, and then painting the surface by applying a base coat followed by a clear coat, and finally buffing the surface to get a nice glossy finish. So let's not waste any more time and let's get started. First, we'll want to make the surface of the damaged portions as smooth as possible. To do this, you'll want to start off by sanding the entire bumper with 40 grit sandpaper. You'll want to pay extra attention to areas that are damaged or peeled. Keep sanding until you feel the area smooth and the remaining paint is the same level as the exposed plastic. To check this, you will do this by running your fingers along the edges of the damaged area. You'll need to ensure you don't feel any bumps along these ridges, and if you do, continue sanding until the surface is flat and has no bumps. You may need to sand for quite some time before the surface is ready. After sanding with 40 grit sandpaper, you will want to then sand with 200 grit sandpaper to remove any large scratches and give a very smooth finish to prepare it for painting. After sanding, we'll then go ahead and fix the broken parts of the bumper with bumper repair compound. It comes with fiber mesh, plastic activator, which basically allows for the compound to stick to the bumper better, and a tube of plastic compound and a tube of hardener. To mix everything, we'll have to get a board like this, and put equal amounts of both compounds onto the board. Add some plastic adhesive activator as well and mix it together. You'll have to mix it quite well. You don't want to have any white streaks, so keep mixing it until you have an even color. Once it's all mixed and you have an even color, you'll then take your plastic mesh and apply the compound to the plastic mesh. Apply compound liberally, and make sure you're wearing gloves. You don't want to get this stuff on your fingers, as it's very difficult to remove. So this plastic mesh basically gives the bumper where it's broken some extra strength. Okay, and we'll apply this plastic mesh to the underside of the bumper. And before I actually started this, I sanded the bottom of the underside of the bumper so that the plastic mesh with the compound can actually stick to the underside. If there's dirt or grease, it will not stick properly, and you'll have a weak fix, which can actually break if there's even a slight some kind of slight collision. So after making the plastic mesh stick to the underside of the bumper, you'll want to apply some compound on the underside of the bumper. This is to make sure that the fix is as strong as possible. Once that's done, you will then take some of the plastic compound and apply it to the visible part of the bumper. You'll want to make sure you get the compound into every single crevice, so that you give the bumper as much strength as possible. Sometimes what happens is you may put a lot of the compound on top of the bumper, and you may have sort of air bubbles in the middle. That when it dries, the air bubbles remain, and basically your bumper is not as strong as it can be, okay, because of these air bubbles. And even in a small, slight impact, it can cause your bumper to break where you've done the fix. While doing this, you may want to go in different directions, so that you can actually fill up the damaged portion of the bumper. Again, don't worry if this is not perfect, as once this dries, we'll be coming back and applying another a layer of bumper compound. After about 30 minutes or so, the compound will dry, and as you can see here, the bumper actually feels pretty solid. As I don't see any movement or anything like that. The only thing is, it doesn't look great. So what we have to do now is we need to apply another layer of compound. But before we do that, we need to try and sand as much of the compound, the extra compound, as possible. So we'll do that with 40 grit sandpaper. Keep feeling the air to make sure you're sanding correctly. So I more or less finished the sanding of the bumper. As you can see here, the level of the compound is the same level as the rest of the bumper. You can check this by running your fingers along the surface. So this looks fairly smooth. The only thing left is this little depression over here, which we'll be filling out with some more compound. So mix up the compound in the same composition as last time, and apply the compound with a little bit more care. You want to apply as little compound as possible in the areas that you've just sanded, the areas that are the surface of the bumper. You just focus on the depression and trying to get that depression as close as the rest of the bumper. Take your time while applying the compound. And try and get the surface as smooth as possible. You don't want to do this multiple times. To rebuild this edge, what I like to do is take my putty knife and rest its edge on either side of the damaged portion, and with one smooth stroke run it across that edge. And as you can see here, more or less mimic the rest of the curve on this edge. We'll come back and we'll fix up any imperfections we may see after this is dried. It's been about 15 minutes, and as you can see here, it's dry, and I'm going to do one more sanding. This time what I like to do is sand it to as much as possible to the surface of the original bumper, and then we'll check to see if it requires another coat. Okay, as you can see here, I've sanded it more, and it's more or less level with the rest of the bumper, except for this small little depression here and here, which we can fill up with some bumper compound. So I'm gonna apply hopefully the final layer of compound. As you can see here, the depression is here, so instead of going this way, I'm gonna go upwards. That way I can use the solid surface of the bumper as the surface to rest my my putty knife. So up like that, slowly apply firm pressure, and then do the same thing on top. Again, do it by applying firm pressure. There you go. So we may want to do this a couple of times, just so that the putty is as smooth as possible and as close as possible to the rest of the surface, because we don't want to do this again. So I've left this to dry for another 30 minutes, and as you can see here, it's very dry. And as you can see, the finish is actually pretty smooth. But to make it perfect, I'm actually going to sand it again with 40 grit sandpaper. You will need to sand this in such a way you're applying firm pressure, so you can finish this as soon as possible. You'll need to keep sanding this until the surface is perfectly smooth. While you keep sanding, stop for a bit and take your finger and run it along the surface. You'll need to feel for any undulations. I can feel this area is more or less smooth, and I'm going to do the same for here as well. So this area it seems like this particular area and here there's a little bit of an undulation, so I'm going to sand that. Again, apply even pressure so that you're sanding all areas equally. And also do not forget to sand the bottom part of the bumper as well. This is very important. So I've been sanding this area for quite some time now, while running my fingers over the surface to check to see how smooth it is. The top feels really smooth, but the bottom, there's this slight depression over here where I filled it earlier. So I'm gonna fill this area with just a little bit of bumper compound. Sometimes getting this perfect does take many attempts. I've had a lot of practice to get to this level. However, don't be afraid to keep applying compound until you get it perfect. I'm going to fill this up once more, and hopefully that does it. I'm going to apply a very thin layer, just enough to fill up the hole. I'm going to start the final sand down. This looks dry. It's been about 15 minutes. You can use 40 grit sandpaper to sand the surface. You want to keep sanding this until the area is as flat as possible. Again, sand with even pressure. You don't want to sand down one area more than the other. So while you're doing this, just keep checking, to see if there are any bumps or undulations. So I've sanded this for quite some time now, and when I run my fingers over this area, it seems very smooth actually, except for a slight depression over here. Now, using the bumper compound may not be the best approach here. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a glazing and spot putty instead. So this is glazing and spot putty. This is used for finishing tiny little pinholes, scratches, and minor dings. This does not have a lot of strength. This is for minor gaps, such as this. As you can see here, there's a slight depression, and we're going to use this putty to fill it up. So again, apply a little bit in your putty knife. You don't want to apply too much, and apply this in the areas where there are depressions. And this should dry in about 15 minutes. So once this is dry, we'll come back and sand this area. So again, a very thin coat, just enough to fill the gap. Now that this is dry, it seems actually almost perfect. What I'm going to do now is sand this down using 200 grit sandpaper and get it even with the rest of the surface. Alright, this feels very smooth. When I run my fingers along this, it feels perfect. It's so level. So basically this is now ready for painting. We're going to prepare the rest of the bumper for paintwork. As you can see here, I've already done a small little portion, patched up tiny little pinholes and things like that on the bumper. The reason I've done this is when I paint the bumper, I want the surface to be as smooth as possible. having a very smooth surface gives you that shine when you finish painting at the end. So how I go about doing this is, what I do is I use my spot putty, and before we sort of apply the spot putty, you want to sand this with 40 grit sandpaper, so we actually have something for the spot putty to stick to. Once the area is sanded around the little pinholes, what we do is we take a little bit of spot putty, not a lot, just a little bit, and go about filling the tiny holes with a very thin layer of of the putty. Again, you don't want to put a very thick coat, because then you'll be sanding and wasting the spot putty. So we'll go about and do this on the rest of the bumper. While you're doing this, make sure you fill up all the gaps on the entire surface of the bumper, as we'll be painting the entire bumper, and you want the best possible surface for painting. So I've gone ahead and applied the spot putty to all the areas of the bumper where I can find little pinholes. We'll wait for this to dry. It should dry in about 10 minutes, and then we will get it ready for priming. So all the putty is dried up, and now we can actually start sanding this, so we can have a smooth surface to apply our primer. So we'll start sanding this with 200 grit sandpaper, and you want to sand this as smooth as possible. So it's all been sanded down. When I run my palm along the surface, I don't feel any undulations, which means this is ready for priming. So before I prime this, I want to give this a good wash so we can get rid of any dust and debris. After giving it a wash, we'll let the bumper dry in the sun for a couple of hours before we come back. Okay. So before we start painting, what we need to do is we need to mask off all the surfaces we're not touching. So the grill, this chrome bit here, the lights, we got to mask all of that stuff off. So to do that, I'm using masking tape and newspaper. So okay, so we've gone ahead and taped all the areas that we don't want paint getting on. The next step is basically cleaning the surface before we prepare for paint. Okay, to clean the surface before we apply the primer, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take rubbing alcohol and take a nice washcloth. Apply the rubbing alcohol liberally and start wiping down the surface. Now we do this to remove any excess dust or any particles or oil that may prevent the primer from sticking. Now that the entire area is cleaned with alcohol, we're going to next apply primer. So what I have here is actually filler primer. Any minor imperfections will actually be filled by this primer. When you actually start applying this, make sure you apply this in thin coats, okay? So what I'll do is I'll stay about 7 inches away from the actual surface and start spraying, okay? And again, you need to do this in thin coats. We don't want to apply too much. So once this dries, one of the things this will do is actually it'll show you any kind of imperfections. So once this is dried, we may actually use some spot and glazing putty on that to actually close those imperfections and then rebrand it. Okay, so it's been about 15 minutes and this is more or less dry. If you actually rub your hand, you'll see this sort of powdery, right? That tells you it's dry. It should not stick, right? And like I said before, one of the things this does is it actually makes you see the imperfections a lot easier. So there's tiny little pinholes that you probably want to fill out so that you get a nice glossy surface once you're done painting. So again, to do that, what I will use is spot putty. So I'll take some spot putty, just a little bit. You don't want to put too much now, just a little bit, and then apply it in those areas where you see little pinholes. And you gotta put a very, very, very thin coat because these are very tiny holes. Now go ahead and do this rest of the bumper. So it's been about 15-20 minutes and all this is more or less dried. What I'm going to do is now take some 200 grit sandpaper and sand these. Alright, now that I've fully sanded this area and made sure that all these areas that I touched up are completely smooth, I'm going to actually clean this area once more with rubbing alcohol. Once this area is entirely clean, I'll put the last coat of primer. Again, once you take it and start applying in smooth coats. It's now time to apply the base coat paint. So I got this aerosol can from scratcheshappen.ca. Essentially, you need the color code, and this typically is found on your driver's side sill, right over there, right? Once you get that code, you can actually look it up in the website, and they will actually ship you the aerosol paint in a can. So to apply this, you have to make sure that the primer you apply is completely dry. Okay, and you stay about I would say about 6 inches away from the surface and start applying in thin coats. Remember, you need to wear a mask while you're doing this because again, you don't want to inhale the droplets. Okay, so I'm going to start right now. Again, you have to apply this in thin coats. Don't be too worried that it's not covering the entire surface. We can always come back and continue this. The technique here is you have to keep moving. You should not, spray in one area. If you spray too much in one area, it'll start dripping, and you don't want that. The base coat has dried, and it's now ready for a second coat of paint. And just like before, we'll apply an even coat, this time making sure we cover up everything. Okay, so the second coat of base has dried, so it's time to apply the clear coat. So just like with the base, we'll apply the clear coat, again keeping the can about 6 inches away from the surface. Again, we want to apply this in smooth strokes while keep moving. When applying clear coat, we would actually go ahead and apply 3 coats. Typically we want more clear coat than base coat, as this is the actual protective layer for your car's body. Okay, we're gonna apply the final coat of clear coat. So again, just like last time, 6 inches away, and keep applying the smooth swift strokes. Okay, so the final coat has been applied to the entire bumper. And as you can see, you can already see the shine. What we'll do is we'll let this dry for a couple of days, and then we'll get to the next step, which would be wet sanding this to get rid of any orange peel on the clear coat, and then we'll buff it to give you, the final finish. So it's been a couple of days since we painted the bumper, and what we're going to do today first is wet sand the entire bumper with 1500 grit sandpaper. By doing this, we'll be removing any imperfections in the clear coat we applied a couple days back, such as orange peel or any dust that perhaps may have settled while the clear coat is drying, leaving a very smooth surface for us. To wet sand your bumper, basically you will take your 1500 grit sandpaper and keep sanding like you would sand, regularly, but this time, keep spraying water at regular intervals so you never, are working with a dry surface. While doing this, you should basically see like a almost milky white residue, sort of form around the areas you sand. Once wet sanded, let the surface completely dry out. Once the surface is dry, we'll begin buffing. In my case, I use an electric buffer with a microfiber pad, and for buffing compound, I use Meguiars Ultimate Compound. If you don't have an electric buffer, you can use a microfiber cloth and do this by hand. You will have to rub the surface in a circular motion. After you finish buffing, wipe down the surface with a microfiber towel. What you'll notice is as you keep, wiping down the surface, you'll start revealing a nice glossy shine on the paint. So keep doing this until you cover the entire bumper. You may need to repeat this step a couple of times to get best results. And there you have it, guys. The bumper is looking great. So much better than when we first started. Thanks guys for watching.